Riley and this is Floral Art Review, and this week in our AI series, DesignEye series, we're looking at While the Billy Boils. This was from a competition some years ago now where we were required to use Australian native flora, and all of the competition, which ran for about 2 weeks, was lines from poetry of some description. This particular day, because it's the Australian native specimen flower judging day as well, we were, as I said, required to use Australian natives in our designs for this part of the competition. While the Billy Boils, for those of you who don't know, is an anthology of poetry from Henry Lawson, a very well-known Australian poet, and I wanted to depict it not in the very literal sense of having a campfire and a billy. A billy, for those of you who don't know, is a tin can that holds water, which you boil for your tea. You throw the tea in and then you swing it around to steep the tea. So my feeling was that the best way to depict the title was to show what someone might be doing whilst they were waiting for the billy to boil, rather than the billy itself and all of the associated fire interpretations that we might have with floral material. I chose to do a naturalistic design. That's one that I'm very comfortable, a style that I'm very comfortable doing. So it means that the placement of the plant material has to be in as natural a way as possible. You have it the way it would be growing and depicting a particular part of the Australian scenery. You can see that I've used as the standard anchor point for the design the tree fence post that is turned at the top, that I've used in many other of my designs that you might have seen along the way. Because this was designed all around, I've given you 2 images to look at so that you can get a sense of what the judge was seeing when they walked around it and judged it. As I've always said, these all-around judging designs need to be interesting from every angle. It's staged on a plinth that is 60 centimetres wide. We had a metre of space to use, so I could go down and outside of the confines of the actual plinth itself, which I've done with the foliage on one of the sides. So I've used a log, a stump of a tree, as the base part of the design. The hat obviously is sitting on the fence post. There's some swordgrass, some xanthorrhea foliage with some craspedia interspersed in it, and some woolly bush and some strands of eucalyptus as well, just to give that sort of drooping effect. And the book that is open but turned up, so they put it down to just check whether the billy has boiled or not. So that was my thinking for the design. It was placed first in the design, and I was very much rewarded by that result because I felt that this was a good depiction of the class title. So let's see what DesignEye, our independent analysis, has got to say about this design. In getting the independent analysis, I simply gave it the 2 images, told it the class title, and that it was that the line, While the Billy Boils, was from the title of the book by Henry Lawson, an Australian poet, and that we had to use Australian native flora. So it had all of that information, looked at the images, and now has presented us with this analysis and some recommendations for things that we might change to make it even better as a design. Balance, first of all. The design has asymmetrical balance with the tall grasses and hat on one side and the cascading eucalyptus and book on the other. This creates visual interest and movement. The weight distribution is effective, though the cascading greenery could be slightly extended or reinforced to ensure an even sense of balance from all angles. So I think what it's seeing there in one of the images, the greenery looks like it might tip over, I think. So it's the image where the book is at the front. To me, that right-hand side, as you look at it, of the greenery, looks like it might not be as secure as it should be, whereas from the other angle, it's okay. So it's just making sure that the space under the greenery from one angle indicates that it is still balanced. So you might think about putting something more underneath the the log on the side where the book is, so that some bark or something, just so that it gives a bit more of a shadow and balance effect for that greenery that's overhanging. Proportion and scale. The hat serves as a strong focal point, drawing attention to the central structure. The combination of tall reeds and lower elements, eucalyptus, books and wood, creates a dynamic contrast in height and proportion. So there's good scale and proportion within the design. I'm a bit disappointed that it sees the hat as the focal point. I can see that it is from these images, but I would rather it had been something of the plant material that was the focus, so perhaps I needed to have the hat hidden a little bit more by some foliage or by some grasses, rather than have it standing out upright there in your face, as it were. I would rather the plant material had been the focal point. Rhythm and movement. The eye is led naturally from the upright grasses down to the hat and then along the diagonal of cascading foliage. The book at the base adds a nostalgic touch and it enhances the storytelling aspect, but its position could be slightly adjusted to be more clearly visible. I guess it's, how can I put it, matter of choice, shall we say. I didn't want, as with the hat, I didn't particularly want the hat to be a focal point. I didn't want the book to be a focal point. I didn't want it to be obvious that, because the title is screaming across the front cover of the book, I didn't want it to be obvious that that was how I was interpreting the design by using the book. I wanted the rest of the design to tell the story, and the book was almost an afterthought. So I'd have to think about how I could place it. I could probably put it over the log and still have the greenery coming over it. So it would be a bit higher in the design. At the moment, there's nothing underneath it. So once again, as I talked about a bit earlier, I put up perhaps some bark or something underneath it to enhance the feeling that it is part of the design. It hasn't just been slid in there as an afterthought. Contrast and dominance. The earthy tones of the wood and hat contrast well with the fresh greens and the eucalyptus and the yellow pops of craspedia or billy buttons. The dark wire mesh in the background adds texture but may be slightly distracting. Considering a more organic integration could help. Now, I am when I looked at these images, as I was putting this up for analysis, I was very concerned about that wire mesh. I can't think why I used it other than normally I would use fencing wire, so a single strand of fencing wire or barbed wire, and I can only think that I had forgotten to bring the wire that I wanted to use, and this was the only wire that I had to hand to be able to use, because I did want it to be looking like a fence and a fence post and the wire that you might find around the fallen logs when you've stopped to boil your billy for your cup of tea. So I very much in favour of doing something about that wire. So let's see what else it's got to say about the rest of the design before we come back to things that we need to improve on. Unity and harmony. The theme is well integrated, evoking the Australian outback and Henry Lawson's literary legacy. The natural materials and rustic colour palette contribute to a cohesive and evocative composition. Competition on the brain. So it is unified, it is harmonious. I can see that in looking at it. The only things that are glaringly problem areas for me now are the hat and that wire mesh. So let's move on. Line. Strong vertical lines from the grasses contrast with the horizontal and diagonal lines of the cascading foliage and log. And that's interesting because often if you can have vertical and you can have horizontal, but if you've got a diagonal line, you have to be careful that it doesn't cut the design in half and you don't get the crossed lines that create a bit of chaos and confusion in our visual balance area. So I think the fact that it's cascading softens that line a little bit, and so it's almost horizontal but not quite, and so it's a good integration of that natural looking material. The wire mesh introduces some irregularity. Perhaps softening or integrating it differently could enhance cohesion. So once again, it's the wire mesh that's creating a problem in this design in terms of the analysis, particularly for line, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. Texture. The rough texture of the wood contrasts beautifully with the smoothness of the hat and the delicate foliage. The wire mesh introduces an industrial element, which is an interesting juxtaposition but might need better integration. And once again, that's very true. I need to have had either the single strand of fencing wire, which would still be a smooth texture and a shiny texture, and that would help with the, it fits in with the rest of the design whilst being metallic. So we get that industrial look, and the same with the barbed wire. It's a rougher texture because of the barbs on it rather than the smooth of the fencing wire. But it's not as dominant a feel to it or a form as the wire mesh is. It's a very dominant form in the wire mesh, and so that needs to be looked at quite seriously. Colour. Earthy neutrals, brown, green and beige, dominate with yellow accents from the craspedia providing a warm, inviting contrast. A touch of red or a deep toned native flower could enhance vibrancy while maintaining the bushland feel. And that's a very interesting suggestion. It is something that I could consider. I'd probably use a grevillea or a bottle brush rather than anything that is more solid in terms of its form, so that I keep the light, airy feel to it. The issue, I guess, for me is that you wouldn't see those flowers necessarily on the ground. What I should look for is a ground cover grevillea that has a red flower and use that in it, and that would be okay. Space. The negative space is well managed, keeping the design open and airy while maintaining depth. Some areas, particularly around the book, feel slightly cluttered. Repositioning elements for clearer visibility might improve the impact. So as I said earlier, perhaps moving the book up onto the log and having it just resting open on the log the way it is standing there now, or having some bark underneath it and just having maybe only one branch coming across the cover of it so that it doesn't feel quite so pushed into that corner to make that corner look like it's doing something. Let's now look at the suggestions for improvement. Consider slightly elevating or repositioning the book to make it more legible within the design. Now, as I talked about, I don't want it to be the focal point of the design, so I would certainly put it up higher and reposition it a little bit, but I would still have it slightly covered with some of the foliage that's already there. Integrate the wire mesh more organically, perhaps weaving it with foliage or shaping it more naturally. And once again, we've talked about replacing that particular wire mesh with single strands of wire or barbed wire to integrate better into the whole of the design. A subtle addition of a darker or red tone native flower could enhance coloured depth. So, and again, I think that that's probably a good idea. I might be concerned about it becoming a bit of a focal point because it's an introduction of a colour that is not anywhere else in that design, and so I'd have to think pretty carefully about what sort of flower I would use. Definitely wouldn't use anything that's a very solid form, so not a waratah, not a Guinea lily, or any of the more, perhaps leucadendron I could use, because whilst it's not a flower, it's got the red tips on it of the green, so that might work in it as well. Food for thought in that one. Just as an overall summary for the final thoughts on this design from our AI, DesignEye. This is a strong and evocative design that successfully captures the essence of Henry Lawson's Wild Billy Boyles. It tells a clear story of the Australian bush with the excellent material choices and strong composition. Small refinements could further elevate the clarity and impact. So what we're looking at there is that those refinements that it's talked about all relate back to principles and elements of design, and that's what you want when you're trying to improve a design or rethink a design. You want to always be thinking of those principles and elements of design, because that's predominantly how we judge, but it's also what will make the design work, in the sense that you look at it and you say, yes, that's exactly right. So there we have our design analysis, our design review for this week. Join me for another one in about a week's time. For now, I'm Q Bailey, and this is Floral Art Review.